Hello everybody, welcome. My name is Rob Hopkins from Transition Network, speaking to you here today from sunny Totnes down here in Devon. And I've been asked to give a sort of an overview of transition and some of the projects and the ideas that are emerging in it, and also how it works, I suppose. So thank you for the invitation to do that. And I wanted to start with this picture, which is one of the most stupid bits of advertising that I saw recently, which was on the back cover of The Economist magazine. And it was an advert for a car, which not only would have you believe that humanity evolved always with little dinner jackets on and has always been male, but also would argue that this particular car and that particular pair of trousers somehow represent the pinnacle of human evolution. You know, we're not going to be able to do any better than this. But actually, of course, what we're seeing around the world and what you're all today drawn together to explore is what comes next. Is the quiet revolution that's already unfolding in villages, in towns, in cities, in countries around the world, of people designing the next step in this story, the next stage. And that's really what we're trying to do with transition, and that's really what I would like to talk about with you today. And actually, for me, we always framed transition for the last 8 or 9 years as being a response to something. We do transition in response to climate change. We do transition in response to peak oil, into all these other questions. Now I think increasingly we don't feel we need to do that, but because it's not about being in response anymore. Actually, it's about being a movement. There is something huge already moving, and actually even if those things weren't problems anymore, we'd be doing those things anyway, because they actually meet our needs better as human beings, as communities, as friends, neighbours, and so on. So for me, I suppose what I would really like to do in this half an hour that we have together is to celebrate something remarkable that is up and running and unfolding in the world. And for me, as somebody who goes to visit lots of groups around the world who are doing this, I notice a number of paradigm shifts that are already happening. We don't have to be lobbying for them to happen. They're already out there. They're already running. So the first of those paradigms I call from anywhere to here, which is this observation that seems to be really building momentum, that place really matters, that the place where you are really matters. The idea that a sense of place is disposable, and that the move to a world where all the buildings look the same, where all the food tastes the same, where all the shops are the same, we lose a huge amount. And that savouring of richness and place is really growing very quickly. For me, one of the key places where we see that is in the craft beer movement, which started in the US. 15 years ago in the US, craft breweries provided a tiny percentage of the beer. It was all huge, massive, huge industrial breweries. Now about 12-13% of the beer sold in the United States is brewed through small, independent, local craft breweries. The explosion of craft brewery in the UK now is such that the Office for National Statistics use craft beer as one of its indicators to measure inflation. What we see in this picture here, when we put two different kinds of beer alongside each other, they're both beer. We're thirsty, we fancy a beer, we could get one, we could get the other, we still get a beer. But actually, what you support and what you are enabling to flourish in the world are completely different. Craft breweries are businesses which have a sense of being rooted in place, in local ingredients, in local culture. They celebrate that place and its identity and the names of the beers and the ingredients they use. For me, the craft brewing revolution is an amazing example where we have a win-win-win situation. We get better beer, we get more vibrant local economies, we have more flavour, we have more taste, we have more stable work, we have businesses that are reinvesting more money into our local economies. That's the model that we can really take forward. So here we have a map showing kind of how the economy works at the moment. Money and resources come in, they get things done to them, and then they leave again. We have this, it's a linear economy. Stuff comes in, stuff goes out. Often the money is just extracted out through supermarkets, big businesses, which really just act as kind of extractive industry, taking money out of our economies. If you look at it like this, when we talk about sustainability, we're really talking about making the two arrows smaller, making the in arrow smaller so that less stuff is going out. increasingly we hear people now talk about the circular economy, which tends to be something done between businesses in a town where you join them up. So one business's waste becomes another business's inputs, and you have more of an efficient way of managing that. I think in transition, we tend to look at it like this. We talk about it in terms of a local economy, which is made up of a series of cycles and interconnections, like a very active recycling of money as many ways as possible, based on this idea of the multiplier effect, where if you go shopping in local independent businesses, if you spend £1 in a local independent business, that's about £2.50 in the local economy. If you shop in a supermarket, it's about £1.40 in the local economy. That's really the foundation for reimagining how those economies work, but they need to start from the bottom, from the place where they are. And local currencies are a fantastic example of this. This is the George Ferguson, the Mayor of Bristol. He takes his full salary, £65,000 in Bristol pounds, the local currency in the city of Bristol. Local currencies are a great example of this as well. There's something which is about tying the economy back together again, reweaving those relationships, saying that actually the economy of this place, that scale really matters, whether it's in Bristol or whether it's in Exeter, where they're soon to launch on the 1st of September the Exeter pound, which is now Exeter City Council's second highest economic priority. These local currencies work so beautifully by starting at the local scale, by building on a valuing of that, by building on a sense that the place and its stories and its history and its culture matters. Whether it's in Brixton, with the Brixton pounds, with David Bowie on their £10 note, a sort of transition design icon, whether it's here in Totnes, where we have a £21 note just because you can, or wherever, there's something about local currencies that are really rooted in that place and its stories. In Exeter, they're launching on the 1st of September. They are going to be hosting some of the Rugby World Cup games. They're working with Exeter Chiefs, whose ground will host some of the World Cup matches. And they're producing this limited edition £15 Exeter note, which celebrates the rugby club. An amazing way of getting people who would never normally come into contact with local currencies involved and really valuing that as a tool. This is Brixton Energy, for example, a fantastic energy cooperative that came out of Transition Brixton, right there in the heart of South London, working with local people, inviting them to invest in a community-owned energy company, which is creating jobs, insulating people's homes. But it's something which is of that place. You couldn't conceive of and create Brixton Energy from Whitehall. This is something that can only come up from the ground, and that's really the first paradigm shift that I see happening all over the place. The second I call divest to reinvest. What we see happening around the world now is this really, really powerful divestment movement, urging companies and organisations to take their money out of fossil fuels. But then what? What we see happening is these diversifying, inspired local economies coming up with all these great ideas. Actually, how do we bring some of that investment into that? This picture here is a brewery that I'm one of the directors of in my town called New Lion Brewery, which really sees itself as being a social enterprise brewery. And the lady in the middle there is Holly Tiffin, who started a project called Grown in Totnes, a big fundraiser to raise the money to put into place infrastructure for community oat production. And so the brewery, we did a special beer called Black Oat Mild to support her crowdfunder. And it's really about how do we support people to invest in local businesses. How communities come together to invest is really fascinating, I think. The point with that, of course, is you want to be the first person out of fossil fuel investment, not the last one. But we're seeing now transition groups getting very motivated and ambitious in terms of the scale of investment opportunity they create for local people. This is Bath and West Community Energy, who are a community-owned energy company that came out of Transition Bath and out of Transition Corsham. they've raised millions of pounds in shares from local people, partly because they have a model where people can move their self-invested pension into community energy, which is a real game changer, I think. But they raised £750,000 in their first share launch. They recently raised another £1.5 million in shares from local people. They give people an annual return. This kind of, there is money around to bring in to really start to change the direction our economies go in if we can get the ask right. And this is Vin de Liège, who are a community-owned cooperative vineyard which grew out of Transition Liège, or Liège en Transition, as they would rather be known, I'm sure. And they recently raised €2 million to set this vineyard up in shares from local people. And last autumn they made their first year's worth of wine. Of course, it doesn't have to be that ambitious. Communities come together to invest in their local enterprises on all kinds of scales. This is in Slathwaite or Slowett in Yorkshire, where the local grocers shut down and the community came together, and in 3 weeks they raised £18,000 that was needed in order to reopen the shop as a community-run cooperative business. And one of my favourite innovations that we see around this is something called the Local Entrepreneur Forum. The Local Entrepreneur Forum is a brilliant bit of transition innovation. The idea is that if you need people to invest in the economy of the future, everybody is a potential investor in that economy. If you can lend someone a pen, if you can help someone with their accounts, if you can babysit for them while they go to the bank, if you can invest £50,000 in their business, all of that is investment. So the Local Entrepreneur Forum brings together people with ideas for new businesses, potential investors, potential mentors, and the 5 businesses pitch who they are and what they do. And then the community pledge their support. I'm doing this, I'll help you with that. I've got a building you can use, I've got this you can use. It's really remarkable. We just had the 4th one, and then we just had the first one outside of Totnes in Lambeth a few weeks ago in London that was really quite extraordinary as well. It's what it looks like when a community comes together behind its change makers. It's something that could work anywhere. And actually, I've never been to a business before, a business related event before, where people talk about love and support quite in that sort of a way. So Local Entrepreneur Forum is a really valuable tool for looking at investment in a very different way. So the third one we call Somebody Should to Let's. So a lot of transition is about stepping up, is about saying this needs to happen and it starts with us now. And we have no idea where this will go. We only know what the next steps are. And it's about really just deciding to make that change happen. But of course, we need the tools to do that. We need the skills in order to make that happen. So in Transition Network, through years now of supporting transition groups and doing this work, we identify a number of elements, what we call our support offer, that really make a difference. So the first one is to develop an initiating group, that you have a group which comes together not with the intention of still being there doing that same work in 5 or 10 years' time, but rather they come together with the sense that what they need to do is to lay the foundations. That's their role, their work of service, to lay those foundations and then to move on to different roles. So setting up the bank account, setting up the structures for the meetings, the website, all that sort of stuff. That's really what the initiating group does. And also brings in a culture of a good group culture. So how that group runs meetings well, how that group makes decisions well, how that group functions together, all of that stuff really matters. The next one is having a vision about what you'd like to see happen in the place around you and what you see the role of the group as being. This is one of the transition groups in London who took out some beautiful fruit trees in pots all up their high street one Saturday to get people excited in the idea of growing more fruit in the area. But actually increasingly people said, can't you just plant them there? Actually walking up a high street full of apple trees in blossom was something they all started to get a sense of, wow, this could be fantastic. So having a vision and helping people to see that is really important as well. Community engagement is a really key part of the support offer. How do we reach out to the people where we are and really engage with them in the huge diversity of the places where we live? This is South Africa, a place called Greyton, in a place there that was originally a township, where there's all sorts of fantastic transition activity going on. This is one of their outreach events. Practical projects as well, getting to a stage where you roll up your sleeves and actually do stuff rather than it just being everyone sitting around talking. You know, that step across relatively early into actually starting to do something that gives you a sense that you can start to change the world around you is really important. This is in Greyton again, where they're doing a project with what are called eco bricks, where this is in a place that was the town dump where they started a trash to treasure festival, they called it. Started by an American guy who went there and said, look at this dump, it's in this most beautiful place, all the mountains behind and forests, but here's the town dump. And actually I spent all my teenage years going to beautiful green fields for festivals and then spending 4 days covering them in rubbish. What would it look like if we had a festival where we turned up at a site that was covered in rubbish and spent 4 days tidying it up? And one of the ways they did that was using eco bricks, which is an idea where you get a plastic drinks bottle and a stick and a load of old rubbish like plastic bags, crisp packets, that kind of stuff. And you pack the stuff into the bag, into the bottle, so that it's so solid you can't get any more in. Then you put the lid on. That's your building material, that's your eco brick. They build hundreds of houses and hospitals and schools out of them in Guatemala and other places. This in South Africa, that as part of Trash to Treasure, here they are working with local young people, building a new classroom using eco bricks. Another part of transition that makes such a difference to this stuff working is what we call inner transition. You know, the idea that this isn't just about solar panels and carrots and bicycles, but that it's also about how we work together in doing this stuff. So many groups who've had great ideas burn out, they get exhausted, they all fall out with each other. You know, how do we design in the skills to stop that from happening? This is one of the things that we do here in Totnes, which is called our mentoring scheme, where anybody working at the middle of Transition Town Totnes can ask for support, professional support, to help them in terms of managing any kind of emotional issues and any work issues. Really makes a huge difference in terms of minimizing the risk of burnout. And then also feeling like you're part of a movement. Transition is now happening in 50 countries around the world, in thousands of communities where people are doing this. For example, this is in Brasilândia, in Sao Paulo in Brazil, where transition is being used to bring people together around issues of empowerment of women, ending violence, social justice, all that sort of stuff. You know, transition looks different in every place, but everywhere you do it, you become part of this international learning network, and that's really exciting. And then the last one is consolidate. So once you have those foundations in place, then you can go on and really do some extraordinary things, like here in Lewis, where the transition group raised £310,000 to cover the roof of their local brewery in solar panels. By the way, if you're thinking by now that beer and brewing is a bit of a recurring theme in this presentation, you're right, we will come back to it, I think, at some point in the future. So laying those foundations is really, really important. You know, transition isn't something that happens by magic. It's something that happens because a group of people decide to give their time, their passion, their energy, their commitment to doing that. And in order to do that, they need as good a support around them as they can possibly create. And sometimes we need things that give people a sense that they can step up. You know, often our experience is, well, there's no point trying to change anything because nothing ever changes, and no one wants to listen to us anyway. So we need things that can help people step across from thinking like that to actually doing things. So this is Transition Streets is a beautiful example of that, as a tool for bringing people together on your street, to street by street basis, to get together with their neighbours to look at energy, water, housing and so on. Started here in Totnes, where 550 households have done it on average, cutting their carbon by 1.3 tonnes each. But in all the research that was done on it, saying the key thing they got out of it was nothing to do with the carbon, was nothing to do with the money they saved. It was to do with the people they met, the relationships they had, how they felt part of this place and its communities. So Transition Streets has now started to spread to all kinds of different places, and that's really exciting. So the fourth of these paradigm shifts that I see happening around the world when I go and visit places doing this is that this idea around local economies and how they are the foundation we need to be building on now moving forward is an idea that's moving from the niche to the mainstream very, very quickly. This picture here, for example, is the new enterprise centre being built at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, which is starting out with this idea of how can we build a building using more local materials. You know, the idea of the local food movement, that if you use local food, there's less carbon, you create more work locally, blah, 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 all those other benefits. We haven't yet moved to applying that to building materials, but the potential is enormous. So they're building this building using a lot of local materials. And one of the things they have run there is a lot of very skilled thatchers. They have a lot of reed. So the outside cladding of the building is with thatched walls, thatched panels. It looks really beautiful, it's kind of intriguing, but it also means that that money that would otherwise go to some big builders merchants and then off to wherever is being kept locally. What would it look like if every new housing development used 60, 70, 80% local materials, clay, stone, timber, cob, hemp? What would that do to our local economies every time a major construction project took place? So this idea of looking at local economies as a form of economic development is an idea that's growing very quickly. Here in Transition Network, we did 3 studies that we called local economic evaluations or economic blueprints. One for here, for Totnes in Devon, one for Brixton as an urban neighbourhood, and one for Herefordshire as a county. And we mapped, where does the money go? Where do we spend the money? In Totnes we found out that we spend £30 million on food every year, of which 22 million leaves through just 2 supermarkets, 17.5 through 1 supermarket. And we have a much bigger local food economy here than most other places. In Brixton, 93% of what they spent on food left through supermarkets. More recently, we did one of these for Buxton in Derbyshire. Only 1% of what they spend on food leaves through local independent businesses. It means that we can start to measure the shift and say, if we could manage a 10% shift here in this town towards supporting local independent businesses, that's £2 million in our economy every year. That's economic development. That's not some abstract sort of yogurt weaving sort of hippie fantasy. That's hard economic development that we can do now ourselves without waiting for anybody's permission. This is in Liège, a project called Ceinture d'Alimentaire, food belt, trying to reconnect the city with the land around it, working with all the different local organisations to say this could be what unlocks the economic future, the economic destiny of this city. And in Preston in Lancashire, Preston City Council recently did an extraordinary piece of work working with the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, where they mapped where all the money goes in Preston. So the City Council, together with the other 7 institutional anchor organisations in the city, so the police, the university, the hospitals and so on, looked at where they spent their money. So in total it was £750 million they spent on procuring goods and services. They were horrified to find that only 4% of what they spent actually went into Preston, and only 39% went into Lancashire as a whole. So they're now doing some incredible work looking at bringing the economy back to Preston. They're looking at moving their pension investments back into driving the economy of Preston. They're looking to design the multiplier effect into their procuring process as a city council. They're looking to become more what they call embedded in place. And it's a remarkable work they're doing there, which they see directly as a response to the austerity agenda, but actually taking back the power themselves over what happens in the city. The 5th shift that I see is I like to call from being a NIMBY to being a SWIMBY. So a NIMBY is not in my backyard. So if there's huge pressure at the moment for development in this country. In the last general election, every party was falling over the other to say how it was going to build more houses than everybody else was. But actually, is a house just the same as a house? Is a job just the same as a job? Actually, there's good, we can do that well, or we can do that really badly. Most of the housing development we see happening around the country at the moment is appalling. Just builds debt, surprise money to distant shareholders, doesn't do anything particular for that place. But if you question that, if you say, that development's awful, then you get called a NIMBY because you don't want anything in your backyard. It's a sort of a derogatory term for anybody who dares to question what's happening. So we came up with this other term of being a SWIMBY, which is something wonderful in my backyard. So it's to say, actually, that's an awful development. We could do a lot better than that. And the communities now are coming together to say, we don't want that, it's terrible. We're not saying we don't want anything, but we definitely know that we don't want that. And sometimes as communities, there's a real role to saying no to things, but in a creative way. Totnes is the first town in the country, or one of the first towns, that managed to stop Costa from opening. Here we have about 40 independent places where you can buy a cup of coffee, and actually we didn't feel that was going to do any good to the local economy. It was a campaign that was fought on the grounds of we could do a lot better than that. But there's other times here doing transition where you have to say, actually, no, that's not okay. Just around the corner from me, from where I live, there's a developer wants to pull down some social housing and build this appalling development, which has got people absolutely up in arms. A huge campaign against it. But the campaign in the last few months has switched from saying we don't want that, we don't want that, we don't want that, to becoming a SWIMBY campaign. Of saying, actually, we can do better than that. That development is just too appalling, and we actually deserve something better than that. So the community hired their own architect who came up with, this is just one of the drawings that he came up with a different kind of approach. Timber frame buildings can be in community ownership. A different economic model, meets the same requirements the developer has in terms of space, actually generates them a bit more revenue. So now we're in an interesting stage where everybody knows the community has a better development. And then we go to planning next week, so I'll be able to let you know what happened. But that for me is a really fascinating, that shift from to say, actually, we could do a lot better than this. The sixth one we call from theirs to ours, which is that what we're seeing now in transition and many other similar movements is this idea that it really makes a difference that as a community we own assets. That to own lands, to own buildings are really central to us being in the driving seat over where we go and what we do. So this is a project that I'm a director of here in Totnes called Atmos Totnes, run by the Totnes Community Development Society, who are trying to bring this 8-acre former derelict milk factory into community ownership. We have a contract signed with the landowners. This is the day when we were able to unveil to the community the announcement of what was going to be happening. It'll be the first community right to build order on that scale in the country, where the community itself will vote for what happens on that site. It's very, very exciting. But underpinning it is the idea that that's just the beginning, that this site unlocks the potential for the community to start to build a portfolio of land, of businesses, of infrastructure that then mean as a community we can start to generate the revenues to really be in the driving seat over what happens to us. And as part of that process, the consultation that we've been doing for Atmos Totnes, we've now consulted about 3,000 people. By the end of the summer, we'll have consulted over 5,000 people in a town of 8,500 people. And actually, when you go to people and you ask them what they want to see happen in their town, the answers you get are very, very different from what current mainstream developers will build for you. For example, this is when we asked people, distilled down out of 2,500 people's answer to the question, what kind of housing would you like to see here? You know, we see new models of ownership, we see ecological materials, roof gardens, walkways, natural spaces, self-build, all of that stuff that conventional development doesn't provide. The next one is called Come Join Us to How Can We Help? And too often I think we see in the environmental movement this sense of, well, we're right, and one day everyone will realise how right we were, and then they'll all come and join us and get involved. And the idea that actually we need to go to where people are is growing really, really rapidly. That it's not enough to say you have to get in, be interested in climate change before you can come and join us. Actually, we need this to be as open as possible. This is a party we want to invite as many people to as we can. This is a project called Caring Town Totnes that's happening here, which is working with all the organisations that provide care in the town, looking at it in a different context. And it's been remarkably successful in terms of bringing people together around owning assets and providing care in a different way. But its starting question is, what makes you happy? What makes you unwell? And that's a really powerful place to start, rather than, do you believe in climate change or not? This is a group in America, in Boston, called Jamaica Plain New Economy Transition, who start out with, they do a lot of their work framed around public health. And here they are taking a group of people around a large laundrette dry cleaning business who use appalling chemicals with a mostly immigrant workforce, and they're coming together as a community to say, we will help you source safer chemicals, and we guarantee that in that changeover from one way of doing things to another things, we will still support your business, we will still use your business. And then the last one of these shifts I call from clone towns to places of possibility. And more, I think we really need places where things feel possible, where a different future feels possible, where you can taste it, where you can see it, where you can feel it, where you can hear it. This is the Crystal Palace food market, where Transition Crystal Palace started this amazing food market. There was a runner-up recently in the BBC Food Awards. These kind of places where you can start to get a sense of the new economy coming through are really important. And this map, this diagram here, which was produced by Growing Communities, an amazing food social enterprise in Hackney in South London, although it's slightly psychedelic and might give you a headache, actually this is their attempt to answer the question, to what extent could London feed itself? So they say that about 2.5% of London's food could come from back gardens, allotments, balconies, 5% from new intensive market gardens spread across the city, 17.5% from the land around the city that was once the land that fed London and now is sort of a lot of stockbrokers' daughters' ponies, 35% from within 100 miles of London, and so on. Actually, when I look at that map, rather than seeing something that looks kind of alarming or whatever, for me that is a thrilling, the potential in that for entrepreneurship, for creativity, for imagination is really quite remarkable. If I were 20 now and I was looking at that, I would be training to becoming a master craft brewer, to becoming an urban mushroom grower who could grow mushrooms on coffee, who could start market gardens on flat roofs in the city. That new economy is there and it's waiting for people to seize it. And actually, so for me, I look at all of this and I see the most enormous opportunity that we have ahead of us now. And I said that we would come back to beer at some point. This is the New Line Brewery, which is a brewery here in Totnes that I set up. Is just one example of how craft breweries can actually start to help the reimagining of local economies. One of the things that we do, we call them community brews, where we do special bottled beer to support different exciting local projects. The Atmos Totnes project I mentioned at the beginning, this is Atmos Ale, a special beer that we did for them, and we do it for lots of other beers. How can a local artisan food or drink producer be one of the threads that starts to weave this new entrepreneurial culture together? And every movement like transition, because it is a movement now in so many places around the world, needs its flags, needs its banners, needs its design icons. This is the David Bowie £10 note from Brixton. I've held this up in talks in other parts of the world and it's got a round of applause before I've even said anything. And I recently went to Paris, in Pré Saint-Gervais, which is a suburb of Paris, to meet the transition group there, big group of people. And the mayor came along and he wanted to have his photograph taken not with me, not with the transition group, but with the David Bowie £10 note. And that's the picture you can see here. You know, these stories that come through transition are really powerful and really, really exciting. So just to wrap up, I wanted to just give you just two quick thoughts. The first thing is, you might be doing transition where you live and thinking it's not really making much impact. The point is with stuff like this is you never know where the tipping points are. I went to Berlin last year, met a group there. They'd planted fruit trees in their park. It had been a lot of work to do it, but they planted 25 fruit trees in their park in the middle of Berlin. A year later, their local government passed a resolution to say that all plants, trees, shrubs, whatever, that they planted as a council would be edible and useful plants. But you can trace that back to that moment of them thinking, let's have a go and do something. Many of the local currency schemes I mentioned earlier can be traced back to a moment in 2007 when I walked into a building here on Totnes High Street where there was an original 1810 banknote issued by the Bank of Totnes, £1 Totnes pound. And the question was, what would happen if we printed some more? And from that inquiry and deciding, yeah, let's do that. Now it's grown and grown and grown. We have the Totnes pound, the Bristol pound, Brixton pound. We now have the Cardiff pound, Plymouth pound, Kingston pound, all these other ones starting. The Bank of England recently had to publish this big statement about their legal understanding of how these currencies work, but it goes back to that moment of deciding to give something a go. And the last thought is, you may be thinking, well, this is all very well, communities are doing amazing things, but how does this affect government policy? It's not going to affect policy making. Actually, just deciding to do things without waiting for permission is one of the key ways that we do change government policy, I think. We now have community energy companies all over the country, some of them transition groups, many of them not transition groups. But actually, when Ed Davey, when he was the Energy and Climate Change Secretary of State, decided he wanted to see a community renewables revolution, there already was one, whether it was in Brixton or wherever. So Transition Network helped to write the community energy strategy, government policy to help support community energy, but that comes out of people having already decided to do it. Don't wait for permission, just get started and make this stuff happen. Because this process of change that we see happening in communities around the world is fantastic. It's something that actually has a potential to meet our needs far better than the kind of neoliberal austerity economics that we're seeing at the moment. It's about doing things for ourselves, plugging the leaks, starting to weave our local economies back together again, bringing entrepreneurship, bringing creativity, bringing genius to designing that and how it works. At the Atmos consultation, somebody once said, you can't help but participate. That day when we opened the gates and let everybody in, a local college made this cake. It took 3 people to lift it. How can we design a new economy in such a way that people will celebrate it with cakes that beautiful? That feels like a real question to me, and that's what we're starting to see happening already around the world. So I hope this has been a useful contribution to your conference. Thank you so much for the invitation to present to you in this way and to allow me to have saved the carbon emissions that I have by staying home and doing this rather than driving or coming on the train or whatever. I hope you have a fantastic conference, and I hope that this idea that local economies are where we start is something that finds a welcoming space in your conversations. Thank you so much.